It's so great to see all of you here tonight. We are broadcasting live from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. My name is Jason Hanley, and I'm the Vice President of Education and Visitor Engagement here at the Rock Hall. Coming to you live from the garage, our great exhibit where you get to come in and play in the garage, and we've posted so many great jams here in the room behind me. It is a real special thing to be able to come to you live tonight with some special guests to talk about the book, The House That Rock Built. We are celebrating across the 25th anniversary of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Amazing to think that the museum here is 25 years old. And the book by Norman Nite and Tom Feran, we're going to talk to them tonight about this incredible story of how the Rock Hall got built. But we're also going to think a little bit about the Rock Hall and its history since it's been open, and we're going to think about it even today and where it's at. We've got some special guests joining us this evening. So let me start with some great introductions. And actually, before I do that, let me say thank you to all of you out there. I know a lot of you are members and donors of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And thank you so much. We appreciate everything. You know, the museum is open. We just closed out here a few minutes ago before the broadcast. So please, if you're out there, the museum is safe. We have some great protocols in place to make it a fantastic place to visit, even during these times that we're experiencing right now. And again, thank you for your support of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I should say also thank you to all of you who already purchased your copy of The House That Rock Built. If you did it through our link on rockhall.com, you were able to order and get a signed copy of the book by Norman Nite. He'll be signing them and shipping out in the next week or so. If you didn't get it, check right down below there. You'll see the link. You can still go on and get a copy. If you got one and you want a second one, because I'm telling you, there's some great stories tonight, and it's going to make a great Christmas gift. So get it for somebody to ship it out for Christmas, for Hanukkah. You can still purchase that copy of the book and get it as a signed copy by clicking on that link down below during the event tonight. Please make sure you do that. That link will only be up until this evening to purchase those signed copies. All right, so let's start with some introductions and bring our guest on here. And of course, we'll start out with the one and only Norman Nite, who is known as nothing other than Mr. Music. What an incredible career Norm has had in radio and broadcasting. So many of us, Norm, I hate to say this, but grew up listening to you on the radio and got our history of rock and roll from hearing you. And what an incredible story that we'll hear tonight, told about how you were so involved in the early days in getting the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to Cleveland and in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in general. We'll talk about that story in a minute, but welcome, Norm. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Very pleased to be here, Jason.
It's great. Let's also introduce Tom Feran, who is your co-author on the book and did a great job. And Tom, of course, has been a newspaper and magazine writer and editor for more than 45 years. Many folks here in Cleveland will know him from his work with the Plain Dealer. I had here too, Tom, that we affectionately can refer to you as the 714th Beatle. So great job on that work as well.
Yes, I'm also the fifth top.
There you go. Right. Tom and Norm, thank you so much. We're going to introduce here some of our other guests as well. We've got Mike Benz with us tonight, and what a pleasure to have Mike here. I joked with Mike earlier, we'll talk with him throughout the night, that he's a character who keeps coming in and out of the book through the story of rock and roll. And Mike is a Clevelander. His work really reflects his passion for the community here in Cleveland, everything from the United Way to the incredible work that Mike Benz did throughout the history of getting the Rock Hall in Cleveland and even being its second director back in the day. So welcome, Mike. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Hey, Jason. Great to be here with my friends Norman and Tom. Spent a lot of time with both of them. So great to be home.
Glad to have you here, Mike.
And we're looking forward to hear some of your stories, like I said, as you feature as a character. And then our last special guest this evening is somebody I get to work with every day, Greg Harris, the president and CEO of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And Greg has been, such an important part over the history of the museum and recently in the transformations that we've been able to make, including things like the garage behind me. Greg, welcome this evening. Thank you for joining us in the conversation.
Thank you, Jason. I'm honored to be part of this with our founders, with Norman Nite, who, Norm, I listened to you on WNBC when I was in New Jersey growing up in near Philly, and you were in New York on the air. So really, truly an honor. And Mike Benz, who sat in this seat in the earliest days of the Rock Hall and is a wonderful community leader in Cleveland and a great friend. And Tom, you've done an incredible job weaving all this together. I have to say, a lot of folks have told me their history of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. You and Norm have captured this broad history, and I learned a lot from it. I'm really proud of having my copy of the book. I'm also proud that Norm put a nice note in here that was very generous. And really, this tells the founding. We've now been open for 25 years, guys. So we're going to talk about what it took to build, but we've been open 25 years, 13 million people. 13 million people have come from around the world to Cleveland to see what you created and experience the power of rock and roll. And we are fully focused on how we're going to treat the next 13 million on the shoulders of what you did. So thank you. We are so honored. And for those out there listening, the museum is open. We have safety protocols in place. And if you're so inclined to get out of the house, come see us. And if not, let's have a great night and keep doing more of these remote things. I'm really honored to be with this crew and look forward to being part of the discussion a bit later tonight.
Thank you, Greg. So we're going to put Greg and Mike in backstage for a minute, and we can talk to Tom and Norm a little bit about the book itself, and then we'll bring Greg and Mike back out to talk to us a little bit about their role in the story and the Rock Hall today. So Norm and Tom, I just want to start by, again, echoing what Greg said. The book is fantastic. We all knew the story was so great. I myself am from New York, and like Greg, an East Coaster, so grew up listening to you on the radio, Norm. And working here, I knew a lot of the story of the history of the Rock Hall, but you guys really went in and told this story in such depth, but in a way that makes it so exciting. I was joking before we went on air here. It reads a little bit like you finish a lot of the chapters and think, well, that's it. That's how the Rock Hall got started. And then the next chapter starts with tragedy again, or, an obstacle that had to be overcome. And it weaves through so many different folks here in Cleveland. Some great folks that many of us who had the honor of knowing them, Hank LeConte and others, Jules Belkin, Mike Belkin from here in Cleveland, weave in and out through the story. So Norm, tell us a little bit why you decided that it was time to finally tell this story here for the 25th anniversary, because you were there from the beginning. Why now tell this story?
Jason, first of all, let me say I'm very, very proud of being with my good friends Mike and of course Tom and yourself and having Greg. But I was thinking about this. For me, this is a trip down memory lane. You see, I went off to New York in March of '73, and that's another story. Little Richard is the reason why I got to New York City in the first place, and that we could save for another time. But anyway, I got to New York. And I had an opportunity to play the records of the people that I really admired growing up in Cleveland as a teenager. And I became very good friends with people that would later become Hall of Famers. Benny King and Dion and Tony Williams of the Platters, the Teenagers, the Flamingos, all these people. I had them as guests on my show. And every single time I had them on Sunday nights, we had a show called the Night Train Show. And it was an hour talking it was called Talk to Me. And they would share stories about rock and roll, their past, but a lot of times it would always revolve around Cleveland and Alan Freed and how important Cleveland was to rock and roll. And I thought about it, and I said, you know what? There's something there. All these performers that are so great. Now, this is, like I said, 1973. I said, this is something that's very, very special about Cleveland, the marketplace, and all these performers. And we have a baseball Hall of Fame. We have a Hall of Fame for basketball and football, but how about rock and roll? So I'll never forget, it was the spring of '82. We had to move up about 8 or 9 years. I got to meet a lot of people in the industry. We hung out together, guys that produced shows on NBC and people that worked at CBS, and we'd all get together like our Mensa group, and we would sit there and we would have times to reminisce about the good old days of rock and roll and the projects and all. And in the spring of '82 at a restaurant, 6 of my friends in the industry were sitting around having dinner. And I mentioned to them, I said, it'd be kind of interesting if someone ever came up with the idea of putting together a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And, they all thought that was an interesting idea. And about a week later, I called up a friend of mine, Bruce McKay, who was a producer of the Tom Snyder Tomorrow Show. And I met with Bruce and a guy by the name of Sandy Fisher, who was an attorney with CBS. And I mentioned it to both of them. I said, what do you think about an idea for a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? And they said, that sounds kind of interesting. And Dick Clark and I had dinner in April of '82 at a restaurant, and I met because he wrote the introduction for my first book. And I said, Dick, you know, you've been around the block, you've dealt with all these performers. Don't you think that they deserve to have something? And he says, yes, I do. And he said, I think that's a sound idea. And then in the summer of '82, I came to Cleveland. There was a Chubby Checker concert, and Hank LeConte was there. And of course, I've known Hank for many, many years. And we were chatting, and I said, Hank, you know, there's a lot of people in New York I'm talking to, Dick Clark and producers from TV shows and artists themselves. They're all talking about Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And he said, you know, that's been an idea that I've had in my mind for a long period of time. So we kind of like sat on that for a while. And then at Christmas time of '82, I came home and Hank was having a concert with Stevie Van Zandt at the Agora.
At the famous Agora, yeah, right.
Yes, at the Agora. And Stevie Van Zandt was there, and Hank LeConte was showing him blueprints of a Masonic temple, and he thought it'd be a great place. So a lot of this stuff started to bubble around in my mind at that particular time, never knowing what to do about it. And I will say this much, that, and then this is where Tom will come in. But what happened here for me was this, that these ideas were floating around at this particular time. But when I got that phone call from none other than Leslie Gore on August 2nd of 1983, and she asked me to be able to join this group for a meeting about a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, that is the thing that started the whole thing. And at the very beginning, I must say this much. Leslie Gore, we lost her 5 years ago, was a sweetheart. We first met on the Mike Douglas show on January 22nd, 1968, when Bobby Darin was the co-host. And I met her there, and we became friends. But I say this, and I say this in the book, I say this in my introduction, and it'll be all explained in the book. Had it not been for that phone call from Leslie Gore, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame would not be in Cleveland, Ohio, period.
I love too, Mike. I'll show people in the book some great photos. There's that one of you with Leslie Gore on the Mike Douglas show back there in 1968. And there's some great photos throughout here. I love that story that Leslie Gore is the one who calls you and says, hey, let's come to New York and meet with, Susan Evans and talk about it. Tom, this must have been a job as a co-writer on this, because we can tell already Norm has so many great stories and so much in there. How did you fit in as a co-writer to figure out how you were going to?
Let me explain how you got that. And I want this is my introduction to Tom Feran, the brilliant writer. In 2015, I went to New York to meet with my literary agent about doing a book about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, because I had it all put together. We met with many publishers, and I was in town for just a week. And on a Wednesday of that week, I was flying back to Cleveland on Saturday. And the Wednesday of that week, May of 2015, we had a handshake deal with a major New York publisher that we were going to sign a contract on Friday. On Friday, my agent called me up and he says, guess what? That person that we talked to, she was fired. I says, fired? Yes. So I don't know what to do. So I boarded a plane, flew back to Cleveland. I was sitting in my office. And I was saying to myself, what in the world can we do? For a week wasted, the book is going to go down the drain. I turned around and looked on the shelf. I saw a book there about the 50s rock and roll from Kent State University Press. I made a phone call to Will Underwood over there. We met, we talked. I called Tom Feran. We met at Sokolowski's University Inn. And I asked Tom, I said, hey, Tom, listen, I got an interest from Kent State University Press about doing this book about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Would you be interested? Tom said he jumped on board, said yes, and now we can go into Tom Feran.
Nothing like sealing the deal over a bunch of pierogies, right, Tom?
Yes, that's how it happened. We have I do have my Leslie Gore button here, which is I Heart Leslie Gore. And I've known Norm for about 40. I've known Norm for about 40 years, and from when he was in New York, and I lived in the area, and also I'd listened to him earlier in Cleveland, and knew the people at Kent. And Norm told his story, and then we talked to about several dozen other people at length, and that's where a lot of the the meat of the book came from. We built a structure, and then it really is, it has a sort of a Rashomon quality to it. I think Albert Ratner said it best early on when I sat down to talk with him. He says, "You'll never get the whole story. You'll never get the real story. Everyone's got a different version," and it's kind of true, and especially because the cast of characters changes as you go through. It's this. It's as you said, Jason. It's about 13 years of cliffhangers, and there's a group that is key at the beginning to get the haul for Cleveland, but that was just basically, okay, you've got the rights, do something with it. And then there was another group that put the site together and got the plans, and then the financing, and then building it, and then of course putting things in it, getting the artifacts and exhibits together. So it was, and a different group of people seemed to be involved in every phase, which was fascinating.
Well, that's one of the things I love about it too, and something the three of us were talking about the other day. The interviews that you have in here are fantastic, and unfortunately, some of those folks are even no longer with us. But not just the story, but the research behind it, the photos, it really does bring that to life. And how long did it take you guys to put the book together, doing those interviews and the research and finding the photos?
Well, I think, like I said, we met. Tom and I met in the fall of 2015, and in earnest. In fact, Mike Benz was the first person that we sat down to interview in February of 2016. So a better part of 4 years of and again, I say this so many times, Tom, you're a brilliant writer, and I was so happy. I'm so happy that the deal in New York died for me in May of 2015. Why? Because I was going to work with a writer in New Jersey. They had the writer picked out, and I would have to fly back and forth between New Jersey and Cleveland to work on this book and everything else. And then when it collapsed and you came into the picture, and Kent State University Press came into the picture, and all of a sudden I was here at home, and we could meet at my house or we could meet wherever. And it was like they said, it was fate. It was meant to be. And the way you handle the book, when I first read the whole thing myself, because of course I was reading the transcripts that you would send me and everything, I said, you were able to weave this thing and put this thing together. Because again, I'm one of those persons, I kept copious notes my entire life. I would write down everything. You could tell me what was going on March 17th of 1984, and I could tell you the exact date and everything. That's what I did. Whenever we had these meetings, I'd sit in the back of the room, and I'd write down, okay, the meeting is starting at 2:45 here at Rockefeller Center. Who's in the meeting? I'd write down all 12 names, how long the meeting was, what we discussed. Nobody did that, but I was a freak about that. I kept copious notes, and so we had a multitude of things to rely on to help Tom set this. I gave him the skeleton, and he put the flesh on the bones.
Yeah, and it's as you mentioned, Jason. A lot of some of the people are no longer around. So I think I felt the real responsibility in talking to these people to get their story and get it as accurately as possible. What their impressions were. Just last week, week before we lost Pat Sweeney, who was a longtime important member of the Ohio House from Cleveland, and he was extremely important in getting the Rock Hall and in getting many other things for Cleveland. He was important to that, and he was also the guy who was, as we tell in the book, was able to get up on stage at the first induction. He was the only person from Cleveland on the stage, and he did it by grabbing a towel and throwing it over his arm, and then grabbing a tray. He was in black tie, so he went cruising through the ballroom with the tray and the towel. And Bruce Springsteen, as he recalled, had stopped him on the way to the stage to order a drink. And Pat said a couple of years ago, he said, I think he's still waiting for that drink. And So he went up there. He's a great character, and he was very important to Cleveland. He was recently lost, and I was thrilled we were able to get his story.
One other thing I wanted to add here is the fact that I am so proud of this book and the work that went into it and everything like that, but also working with so many people in Cleveland and in New York. And the one thrill I got, I mean, to this day, I'm just overwhelmed with that, is the fact that on January 23rd, 1986, the late Scott Muni, a legendary disc jockey from New York who hailed from Akron, and myself had the honor and the pleasure of inducting Alan Freed into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Now, understand, as a young man in Cleveland in 1951, 1952, 1953, and listening on WJW, Alan Freed, the Moondog Show, and being able to hear about the Moondog Coronation Ball, and being able to later on, of course, he passed away in January of '65, but I got to know his son and his children and some of the two of his wives, and to have the honor of being able to be, the people that are inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame are inducted by fellow performers. So when Chuck Berry gets inducted, it's Keith Richards, and when Bill Haley gets inducted, it's Chuck Berry, and when Billy Joel inducts Fats Domino. But this was an exception that they allowed Scott and myself to induct Alan Freed into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I said, that's a very, very special honor. How many people can say that they stood at that podium and was able to induct a legendary performer into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? And that will stay with me for the rest of my life.
Yeah, amazing. And, Alan Freed, of course, in the book and in the story and here in Cleveland and even in the museum, such an important part of the history of rock and roll between, the Moondog Show, the Moondog Coronation Ball, which features even in the book with the Moondog Coronation Ball 2 and how that all came about. And I think this is a good moment. Let's bring Mike and Greg back on screen with us so we can talk a little bit about the story. As I was saying to you guys, we could not cover the story that is in this book if we did this every night for 3 weeks. It is so jam-packed, and every page turns another chapter, another idea. But I've got a few things here at least to get us started, and we can open it up as a cool conversation. One I wanted to ask, and maybe Norm and Mike, this would be a good one for you guys to start out. The stories in the book, working with Ahmet Ertegun in particular, very early on in with his work with Atlantic Records, and then working with him for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And what a giant, of course, in the history of rock and roll, so much of what Ahmet was able to do. Can you guys share any stories with us about working with Ahmet Ertegun in the early days about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and how it came about?
Well, what I remember is that when I was brought on board to become part of the Rules and Nominating Committee by Seymour Stein of Sire Records, when we would have our
intros in the book here too, a good plug for Seymour Stein.
We would have our meetings, and we would sit down in the boardroom, and I looked around the room, and I see John Hammond, the guy that discovered Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen and so many others. I mean, you look at Neshui Ertegun, Ahmet's brother, and you look at Jerry Wexler, and you look at John Landau, and all these legendary people of rock and roll. And yet what would happen is it would be a time for sharing stories. I just sit back and listen. And they'd talk about the good old days of rock and roll. Remember when we came to Cleveland and we brought the records in? I'm not going to name the name, but they say we'd go into the radio studio with the 78s and would stand there in the record room. And one of our guys would go and talk to the disc jockey on the air. And I would take my key and I would break all the other 78 records and would leave a stack of our records so that when they wanted to continue to program the show, the only thing they had that was playable were our records, And then when they were talking about when Muddy Waters was painting the house over at the Chess Brothers, and he said, "You got Muddy Waters painting your house." So the point of it is what we would do with these meetings, and for me, it was just that's a book in itself. Ahmet Ertegun, he was the prime man. He was the focal point of all this. Everybody just looked up to him. He was a genius in what he did with his brother starting Atlantic Records. But just listening to the stories and everything else, and that's where I got to meet him. I always admired him as a young person, knowing his career, the label of Atlantic Records, but then having a chance to meet him and speak with him on a casual basis and talk to him, he was just one of a kind. And I value the friendship that I shared with the late Ahmet Ertegun.
Now, Mike, I should say for you, yeah, I was going to say, Mike, you know, early on got brought in to really help put together the committee to bring the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum to Cleveland. And you had so much interaction with Ahmet too. Tell us a story from your time working with Ahmet.
Yeah, Jason, actually didn't even know about New York, frankly. We saw an article in Crane's Cleveland Business about a guy that wanted to start some local deal. And because of some of my background, which is in the book, which I won't go over, but things like meeting the Beach Boys when I was in high school and helping with some of the early concerts when there wasn't a Belkins or a Live Nation,
Right.
setting up chairs. So, you know, I was kind of primed to see this article, and my job was executive vice president at the chamber, right? So economic development, jobs, image, you know, it's my town. I was born here. And at the early days, we put a committee together actually in April of 1985 and didn't know Norman. Then I was introduced to Norman by the guys at MMS and Timmy LaRose, who's like my brother, and I think he's listening tonight. And Tim became the vice chairman of our civic committee, and I chaired it. And I'm kind of like director -1 before we had a director. So,
Founding director, Mike, founding director.
yeah, whatever. But you know, at the end of the day, you know, all of the, you know, it's like Lenny Barker's perfect game no-hitter, right? Everybody was there at the beginning. You know, I kind of giggle, but the fact is, I had the honor and privilege through Norman and to relive a lot of the words with Tom and Norm, to know Ahmet. And I did hear the story about how they visited WJW, including Alan Freed, etc. And they were in the business of promoting Atlantic Records. And so that story that Norman just told brings back memories, because it's not my 25th anniversary. It's my 35th anniversary. So, you know, at the end of the day, we understood early on. Once I met Norman, and I don't know, this is probably telling tales out of school. I recruited Norman to our committee. And I said, Norman, it's such a pleasure to meet you. You're so important. You're on the committee in New York. We now have to try to get in front of them. And he told me about Ahmet Ertegun and Nasai. And he told me about the people that sit around that board who were the leaders, and some of them are still the leaders of rock and roll and contemporary music in the world, right? So being just a local Chamber of Commerce guy, I'm totally intimidated. But Norman pointed out the importance in the background. It's a snapshot of our lives through our lives. You know, Norman taught me, literally taught me, you could name a song and people could tell you where they were. So this is about your life. It's not just music, it's our lives. And so Ahmet helped fill in big time the color, and we can get into the first meeting, but the first thing we had to do is convince Norman to be on the committee, and which he wanted to do for his hometown. And second, get an audience with them. And I'll kind of leave it there to tee up some of the story. But when he told us who was going to be in the room, if we ever got the chance, you know, it was pretty intimidating. If you think about, you know, hey, we want to introduce you to the entire live, all the leaders of rock and roll in the world, and you just guys come in from Cleveland.
I think that part of the book is so amazing, right? That story of so many cities could have potentially vied and did eventually vie for it.
Well, Jason, here's one. Excuse me for interrupting, but there's a tag on what Mike just said, and it's very, very important. And I have to make this point. When I had that meeting with Mike Benz and the various people at the very first meeting that were there, the Hank LeConte and Jules Belkin and Bill Bryant and Bill Smith, and all right. When I went back to New York and I met with Ahmet Ertegun, and this is very important for the whole history of this whole thing, and that is when I met with Ahmet in his office and I asked him would he consider Cleveland as a site for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and he said absolutely not, because we have a place in New York City on 42nd Street. And he says, my phone was ringing. Forgive me. So when he said to me that we have a place on 42nd Street and it's all picked out and everything else like that. So the thing of it was with me is if I got up and I shook his hand and walked out the door, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame would probably be a place on 42nd Street. But what happened was, the one word you have to learn in all of this is the word determination. Determination, that's very important, because when Ahmet said we have a place on 42nd Street that Mayor Koch had promised us, and again, if I shook his hand and thank you and called him up, Mike Benz, and said, Mike, it's not going to happen. But because I hit the right button on something about Alan Freed, the neutral market, whatever the case may be, he called out to Susan Evans. He said, when's our next meeting? And that's July 18th. I called up Mike Benz. I said, Mike, listen, I got your foot in the door. And that was so my point of all of this is this. In life, if ever you have a situation that you think is inoperable, it can't happen, never give up, because that's one lesson I learned a long time ago. Have determination. If you believe in it, follow it through and see it through. And because of that, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is a thing of beauty that came to be.
Look, and I said, Jason, at the end of the day, when Norman called me, and it's very dangerous to tell me that there's a crack in the door. At the end of the day, we had a wonderful committee that some of the names Norman mentioned, you know, Timmy LaRose was my vice chairman, and Jules Belkin was involved. There's this big list that actually the Rock Hall has a lot of the memorabilia that I've donated to them from the early days, including the original presentation. And I'll never, ever forget that opportunity. And we said, we're going to New York. We're taking the mayor, the governor, you know, we're taking Mary Rose Okar. We're taking the head of the convention center. We're going in guns loaded. And I think some people today might learn that story, because if you've got collaboration and you've got your act together, like Greg has been able to do, and Terry before him, to not only keep it going, they haven't kept the Rock Hall going. They grew a dream from groundbreaking to this unbelievable world-class museum that, you know, really the world envisions. But when we went to New York, we had to figure a way not to be the Chamber of Commerce. We couldn't be the civic organization. We had to hit them in the head with a 2x4. And so we got, believe it or not, Goulardi, Ernie Anderson, to do a voiceover on a videotape. And that videotape really started with Ernie Anderson. And because of Norman's input, we grabbed a clip from Norman of Alan Freed, if I remember correctly, from Blackboard Jungle, talking about rock and roll. And we used the theme song in the background. We built this city on rock and roll. And I'm telling you, Amit's back was to the screen at the beginning. When he heard Alan Freed's voice and he heard we built this city on rock and roll, he started turning around and he saw that screen. And so our mission was to fuzz up their thinking about New York. We said, we have some opportunities in Cleveland. And by the time we left after that first meeting, letting all the other people talk from Cleveland, and the New Yorkers were really good about, from 15 minutes, I think, Norman, we were there over an hour.
Well, I want to tag with two quick things. Mike, the movie was Mr. Rock and Roll. Now,
great film.
Yeah. Now, that being said, the thing that's very important, which a lot of people don't realize, is this: when we had our original meetings, they would be maybe hour, 2 hours long. 90% of the good old days, 15% or 10% would be to talk about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. When the whole group arrived in the lobby that afternoon for our meeting at Atlantic Records, I was standing next to Ahmet Erdogan, and so Noreen Woods, Ahmet's secretary, who came up and his assistant said, Ahmet, they got the group from Cleveland downstairs and they're ready to come up. He said, no. Have them wait till after our meeting. And I thought, my God, they'll be dead in the water. If they come up here after 45 minutes or an hour, they have to have at least 45 minutes or an hour to present themselves. They would never do it. So I said, Ahmet, bring them up now. And he looked at me and said, all right, Noreen, tell him to come upstairs. And that was the whole key, because, again, if you guys came in at the end of our meeting, forget about it.
So hearing that from Norm and from Mike, the book captures that excitement really well. Norm, you did a wonderful job, and Tom, grabbing Mike's story, elaborating on it, and knowing some of the players in the mix, knowing that that Tim LaRose was there, and that Albert Ratner was there, and you said Jules and Dick Celeste and others, you can sort of see that group. And I kind of like you guys sort of standing it's sort of Cleveland against the world. And you went in and you didn't take no for an answer. You impressed them with the quality of work that could come from a place they weren't expecting.
One final thing I want to say about the book, one final thing, and then I'm done. One final thing, and that is this. I want to be able to say a great big thanks to my dear friend, Miami Steve, Little Steven, Stevie Van Zandt. Why? I've known Stevie for umpteen years. And when I called him up, because I was thinking, who could I get to write the forward to this book? And I'm thinking, should I get Paul McCartney? Should I get Elton John? Should I get Billy Joel? All wonderful, wonderful human beings. Great. And I'm thinking, who really knows the history of rock and roll and is a devotee of rock and roll history? I'm thinking, I said, hey, it's a no-brainer. So I picked up the phone, because Stevie's always with Lilyhammer and doing shows and Sopranos and all the things that he was doing. And I said, I know this guy's got so much on his plate. Who knows? I called him up and said, hey, Stevie, listen, we got this book coming out about Alan Freed, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Cleveland, Ohio. I got to ask you a question. Would you be willing to write the forward? You got it. When do you need it? I said, as soon as possible. I thought he's going to send, paragraph, like most people do. 4.5 pages.
Good read. It's an exciting,
beautifully written.
Yeah.
They did a good job. And I got to tell you that Norman was right about determination and tenacity. That group of characters that's listed in the book, and every one of them, it wasn't, oh, do we have to go? We had this civic committee that met monthly, and Norman would fly in.
Dick Pogue's office, right, over at Jones Day?
Well, that was the second go-around.
Uh-huh.
The first go-around, we actually met at the Growth Association offices about once a month. And that went on. We got them here to Cleveland. We did a big tour, including stopping at different places we proposed that they could build, including we stopped, and I'll never forget it. Norman remembers. Norman was on that bus ride, and we had everybody and his brother on a bus ride going around Cleveland. And we stopped at Record Rendezvous, and we stopped at the WJW studios. But at Record Rendezvous, they all got off. Amit, all of them. Jan, they went in. It was like Nirvana. It was like this holy mountain, because that's where the original records came from for Alan Freed's show, the Moondog Show on WJW. And we happened to have the petitions there that when we ran the petition drive, every one of them signed it to bring the Rock Hall to Cleveland. And then later that day, which was, I think, partly pivotal to really get them their attention. Coming to Cleveland, it was, a big deal for us. I don't know how big the deal was for them, but I can tell you that at the end of the day, we presented 660,000 signatures. Wow. That MMS and all these people helped us gather, and they were pretty impressed. And they said, okay, you guys are serious about this. And we kept it going. And I could tell you, and it's in the book, and they did a wonderful job, story after story, including don't do anything more. And I will tell you a funny, quick story about Norman. We're sitting in the conference room, and it's now after the induction ceremony. It's after the USA Today survey that Cleveland blew everybody out doing about where the Rock Hall would be with all these other competitor cities. And of course we orchestrated and worked and gathered signatures, but we're sitting in the conference room, and Susan Evans said to me, don't do anything more. We understand you want to be the Rock Hall. So we're sitting in this room in February, and we're saying, now what can we do? What can we do? And Norman stops the whole meeting, and he goes, do you remember what March 22nd?
21st.
21st, 1953.
52.
52. He goes, do you know what that date is? And I said, no, what is that date, Norman? He said, well, that's the Moondog Coronation Ball where 2,500 were supposed to show up, particularly African-American community, because there were a lot of those performers that had been on the air and been on Alan Freed's show.
Right.
Instead, 25,000 showed up, right, that they captured. So when he said that, we said, well, that must be the day that rock and roll was born, right? And truthfully, that intergenerational group of people came together to listen to this music that was such a blend that Greg and everybody has told such a wonderful history at the Rock Hall and in that book that we then staged the next, after I don't know how many years, 40 years, Moondog Coronation Ball in venues all over Greater Cleveland. And I got another phone call from Susan, and she said, hey, don't do anything more. And Norm and I were on top of City Hall with Good Morning America trying to answer why Cleveland should be the site of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So those are just little tidbits that Tom and Norman captured. But when you live it for over a year until that fateful day that I got the phone call from everybody in New York, we won, and I had tears in my eyes. And it took, this baby had a lot of mothers and a lot of fathers, and it still has a lot of parents and grandparents and great-grandparents that care a hell of a lot about rock and roll and the people that were involved. And the people that are running it now have preserved that importance, not for just Cleveland, but for the world.
Thank you. Well, Mike, hearing that you say we won when they gave us the rights to build it, that's when the real work began, right, guys? And you get awarded it, and then you need to raise 40 million, 50 million, 60 million, 90 million. You had to get architects on board. You had to do all that stuff. It's really wonderful the way that's spelled out in the book, because without just winning it wasn't enough. It then needed to be created and built, and then it needed to be open to the public, which is really wonderful.
And Greg, I got to tell you, 6 years went by. Okay. I hired the first staff, Chris Johnson and the team of people. A lot of the volunteers went off and did their thing. Some of them, God bless them, stood with it. New people came involved. Dick Pogue. Dick Pogue was instrumental. Albert Ratner stayed with it. Timmy LaRose stayed with it. But 6 years went by from 1986, when we celebrated that victory. All of a sudden, in 1992, there was a very famous meeting in New York, where New York said, look, guys, you've had this for 6 years. I wasn't a part of that. That was the mayor and the governor at the time, Mike White then, and George Voinovich, rest his soul, went to New York. Dick Pogue, Timmy LaRose, a lot of people. And they basically said, listen, guys, you got to get your act together and get this money raised. And now it had got IMP involved, and there was this unbelievable design. The location discussion started taking a change from the Tower City site to the lakefront site eventually. And at that moment, they said, you either get your act together or you got to rethink what we're doing. And Cleveland could have lost it again. And as Tom pointed out, and so did Jason, every chapter, it's like you're in and you're out. You're in and you're out. Well, 6 years went by, and I was on the outskirts, kind of doing my thing back at the Greater Cleveland, what today is the partnership. And I got this infamous call from Dick Pogue. I was in Texas at the time at a meeting. He said, I'd like to meet with you. And I won't go through all the bloodbath, but at the end of the day, they gave me the opportunity, I didn't think it was at the time, to go back to the Rock Hall and be the director. And Greg, sit where you were sitting. And truthfully, Clevelanders showed up again. It was all about a test for us of the community. And we figured out how to go from that 40-50, doing a bond issue, the people at Key and McDonald Finance. I mean, there are so many players. At the end of the day, we broke ground finally with the money in hand in June of 1993. And I was so proud. And Norman was there, and Yoko Ono, and Sam Phillips. And I'll never forget Sam Phillips, who was Sun Records, and things that Norman again taught me, came across that stage, gave me a big hug, because he was one of the competitor cities from Memphis. And
Right.
he said, you know what? You guys deserve it. And Yoko gave us a big hug. I mean, it's the kind of thing that if you live every day, Greg, but for, local people that tried really hard to help our community, the jobs, the image, the excitement, man, I want to tell you, that was a proud moment, man. We broke ground, and we had Billy Joel, and we had Chuck Berry, and it was a big deal. And steel was going up, glass was going in, and it was, it got crazy.
Well, for those of us that are lucky enough to be the stewards now, and we'll all change over time, as well as those 13 million visitors that have visited, thank you for getting that up, getting the approval, raising the money, fighting the fights that needed fought, and also celebrating the victories. Mike, you guys all nailed it. On our director front, we got to recognize Dennis Barry, who was a great contributor. You're a great contributor. Dave Abbott, and of course, Terry Stewart. Wonderful, wonderful legacy that all of you left. And we're steaming full speed ahead for sort of the next chapter in this place, and we're celebrating where we've been.
And I told Norman he's better start inking a new book, because the chapters keep going on. And God bless you and Terry and all the rest of them that not only made some of us that were involved feel like brothers, and we are brothers, because when you spend so many hours doing this with the kind of team we had, some of the people here and the continuing team, it really is a brother and sisterhood that a lot of people have benefited. In tough economies, the Rock Hall continues. With COVID, the Rock Hall continues, even virtually, but now live again. Whether it was Guitar Mania or all the books, and now this book, bringing it all together. I can just tell you, every day I'm so proud to have had some role in this crazy journey, including with Norman and Tom. We sat for hours going through the stories and identifying the photos, and it was just a blast. So thank you for everything you're doing, Greg.
Thanks. Well, we owe it to everybody to get the story right. And this is the most powerful art form ever created. I maintain it's the only museum in the world where every single visitor has a lifetime of memory connected to the things in the museum. And that's the same reason that drove Norm in the beginning. Mike, it's what drove you. It's what drives all of us. And we're fortunate to be able to do this and to inspire and engage people through the power of rock and roll.
I just want to say, in closing on my portion, first of all, I want to recognition to a dear, dear lady, Janet McCoska, who supplied me with such fantastic pictures for this book. Janet has been such a sweetheart and been there for me all along. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has become a signature of Cleveland, just like the Space Needle in Seattle or the Eiffel Tower in France and Statue of Liberty in New York City. It's very, very important. But there's 3 points I'd like to make. 3 points. Understand, this book is not about me, Norman Nite, Tom Feran. This book is about something that happened that was very, very special. 3 things I want to be able to accomplish. Number 1, I want to be able to make sure that Leslie Gore, every time somebody plays a Leslie Gore record on radio, remembers the fact that she was very instrumental in making this happen for myself and the city of Cleveland. Number 2, this book is to pull back the curtain, to be able to show the people in Cleveland and the people in New York that worked diligently to make sure that this thing would be a reality. All those years, all that hard labor. And finally, this is an homage and a tribute to the people of Northern Ohio, the fans that signed the petitions, the fans that made the phone calls, the fans that rallied at all the events, the fans that wanted the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. This is your book. This book will show the world how much people feel about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Because again, take me out of the equation. I don't care. I just want this book to be successful so it could show the world that we embrace rock and roll, we love rock and roll. But here is the true story about how this whole thing happened from a little idea to this thing that is known worldwide. So that's what this book represents for me. And I hope that people get an opportunity to buy it, read it, and savor it for years to come.
Yeah. Norm, that's very, very well said, and it reminds me that the legacy of this is all that hard work you talk about. It's also the legacy of Alan Freed. It's the legacy of the Belkins. It's the legacy of WMMS and all those things that mean something in Northeast Ohio with Flash and others. And then on the other side, in the New York side, there are people that have been involved in this thing called Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for 35 years. Yeah. They put their heart and soul into that as well. And working with them, with Jan Winter, you mentioned Amit as the founder, of course. John Landau has been involved for years, and Alan Grubman. And it's just a really, everybody has their hearts in the right place, and the outcome has been terrific.
And I just have to say that to all of us that have had a moment in this long spectrum that's going to continue, that it really, I think it was beyond. I remember the first architectural drawings. I remember the early conversations about education. I remember being in the room when we cut the deal with Tri-C to be the education partner early on with Bill Burgess and the president at the time, Nolan Ellison. So, it's got, as I say, a lot of mothers and fathers. It's got a feeling of passion. And actually, Tom will tell you, the original name of the book, I didn't like so much. And I spoke up and I said, guys, how about the house that Rock built? And it was a theme we used a long time ago at the Rock Hall. So, I hope this book is a bestseller. And beyond that, I hope people grab it because it's a part of a lot of people's hearts and a lot of people's minds. And Tom and Norman, thank you for doing it and allowing me to be a small part.
It's a pleasure working with all of you right here, to having a chance. And Jason and Greg, thanks for allowing us to be able to share these stories with the fans, because so many times people over the years have always said, hey, how come Cleveland has the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? How did I get it? And this book will tell the story. And I appreciate so much your efforts in making this book possible to be able to be sold at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I personally am going to autograph those books. And again, there's nothing I can say except thank you so much, and rock on. Tom, you have something to say? Tom?
Yeah.
You have something to say?
You put him on the spot.
Say something,
No, it's said. I'll help by Leslie Gore. I heart Leslie Gore here.
All right.
No, it is a great story. It has a lot more elements to it than people would know. You mentioned Norm mentioned Stephen Van Zandt. He did the foreword. He also did a terrific talk in Cleveland at Lakeview Cemetery when Alan Freed was reinterred. His ashes were 4 years ago, and under which is worth seeing in itself. His gravestone, the jukebox there, and Stephen had a really nice talk for that event, and it was one of those things that was showed sort of the influence and the effect of the Rock Hall all over the city, with the number of people who came there and really harkened back to the beginning.
And I'm glad, Greg, that you guys really have made it possible for Norm and Tom to pretty much jettison this book from the place that helped create the book, from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum. And I got to tell you that I can't wait to see the next several chapters that you're creating, the new exhibit space, all the excitement that you've done already. People need to get down there because it changes all the time. And I will tell you, and I hope people sign up right now, because I too am lucky enough to have Norman's autograph, and I'm going to get Tom's autograph, and I'm going to get Greg's autograph, and I'm going to get Terry's autograph. So, maybe we auction it off sometime to raise some money for the Rock Hall. And that's the other thing I wanted to say, that Greg, you've been pretty good about not doing that, and Jason, but I want to do it. So, as your brother, you guys are fabulous. And I hope everybody understands that it takes money and volunteers to run that place. Please buy something, buy the book. Donations go to the Rock Hall. These things don't just happen. It does take money, and it takes people, and we're blessed to have the people. We could use the money, particularly during this tough time. Nobody's flush, and it takes an incredible effort to raise the dollars, to keep the doors and the education and the learning and the continuing going. And so this book not only contributes to the hall and to the education, but I'd ask everybody, join the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Go down there and visit it and buy the book, and then buy some memorabilia as well.
Well, Mike, thank you for the plug. A lot of the folks on today's event are members of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and we really appreciate member support, donor support. We're very, very grateful. We are a nonprofit educational institution, and we rely on that support to do all the great work that we do. But if you're not a member, sign up. You get exclusive access to a lot of different things at the museum. You get invited early, and you're part of our family, and you help maintain this legacy. And it's really, there are folks on this call that have been members for 25 years, and there are founders. We're grateful for them. But if you join today, in 25 years, you'll be a 25-year member too. We really appreciate that support, and it's meaningful. What we do every day at the museum is we engage, teach, and inspire through the power of rock and roll. We do it in our exhibits. We do it with live music. We're still doing live music on our plaza on Thursday and Saturday nights. We do it through our educational outreach. Jason heads up that division. We have stuff online that 1,000 teachers a day were using in April and May during COVID. 1,000 teachers a day were using our resources to teach social studies, technology, history, all through the prism of rock and roll. And in a normal year, we'll have 20,000 students at our museum experiencing the power of rock and roll and learning in our environment through our great museum teachers. We just opened up a new social justice exhibit. It's the way for the rock and roll to respond to what's happening around the country right now. And we've got spaces in the museum for visitors to play instruments and jam with each other. It's a very much a living, breathing place. One of the greatest compliments that we had with our new changes was one of our past board members said, "You're doing the stuff we dreamed about 10 years ago." And we're doing it every day. We've got a wonderful team. We've got a legacy of our founders. And then every day people are delivering great stuff for rock and roll fans. So we're grateful to you guys for having got this place built, for being part of our family still. Norm, this book will be in our store, at our website. And, let's get you down and do something at the museum. I would do this every night of the week just to hear you guys talk among yourselves. It's just a pleasure.
I can't wait for the opportunity where we can have a live audience and we can be able to come on stage and share some real stories about rock and roll.
Super. Fantastic.
Norm, that's actually a good segue, because we've
I'll
got
debut my music.
It's a variety show. Yeah, look at this. Somebody grab one off the wall for me. I got a few behind me. We actually have some questions that have been coming in from the audience. I think it's a perfect segue, Norm. You set it up for me. Just a few things here. We'll start with one that came in that asked about the lead up to the opening. We talked a lot tonight about the process of making it happen, but what was it finally like? They want to know in those moments right before the museum opened, the grand opening 25 years ago. Mike, Norm, anybody, what was that like, those last moments before the door opened up?
Look, I'll never forget that night. First of all, leading up to it, it's kind of like surreal. It's hard to, a lot of people work. And by that time, I had already become, quote unquote, an observer at the opening, and they invited some of us back, and I had the privilege of walking the red carpet that night and sitting at the governor's table and being with Tim LaRose and Mary Rose and Amit and Norm and all of the folks. In fact, I'll never forget that we had Stephen King, the author, and his band. Right? And so it was a big deal. And it was, people, once we broke ground and all the work in construction, it was believable. But for almost 10 years, it wasn't believable. But at that moment, literally, it's another one of those, to me, heart-jerking, tear-popping moments that says, oh my God, it's real. This is really it. And I getting interviewed by one of the Supremes as we walked down that aisle. I mean, it was crazy. I mean, it was surreal.
Mike, I want to augment and ask you guys, that was when the museum, but the opening concert, when Chuck Berry steps on the stage backed by the E Street Band and just rips off Johnny B. Good. How did that feel to be in with 60,000 people in the stadium?
Well, I gotta say something about this. I, at the time, flew in with my boss from CBS FM, Joe McCoy, and Cousin Brucey, the legendary Cousin Bruce Morrow. And we came into Cleveland to work because I was doing a radio show at that particular time. So what happened was, when I flew in with my crew from CBS, all the thing I was going from, they had on 9th Street, all these different booths set up. Everybody was broadcasting. So I was going from booth to booth to booth, much like I'm doing now, doing interviews. And then when they had the concert, I was doing my show. So all the great things that happened that people said, what did you think of the concert? I said, I was on the air that night. I didn't see it. What did you think about this? I was working. I was doing interviews. I didn't see it. So the point of it is, it was kind of a sad thing. I love doing my show and everything else like that, but it was a work engagement for myself. And many of the things that transpired, except for the dinners and everything else, I was not a part of, unfortunately.
Well,
we're the workers, man.
At that concert, first of all, it was one of the first times my actual family, got to enjoy what I was involved in all those years. And they were sitting, and we were with, Avery Friedman. We were with a lot of the rock and rollers who jumped out of their front row seats and went backstage and then performed. And to see that, and you're sitting there as part of the group, was a blowaway. I mean, this is Cleveland, Ohio. This is where I was born. This is happening here at the stadium. Give me a break. I mean, it was the biggest concert I've ever been to, and I've been to a lot of them.
I think another question that came in asked about, so many years now, 25 years have been open, all these amazing exhibits that we've had at the museum. And they wanted to know, it's Rich on Facebook here. Oh, it's actually Rich Banish, who's a public school teacher and comes to a lot of our programs and volunteers occasionally. Wanted to know, for you guys, is there a particular exhibit, either from the opening or since then, that was a favorite of yours? Some favorite exhibits at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Norman, go ahead, please.
Well, myself, because I'm always the historical guy. I like the roots of rock and roll, the early things. There's Sam Phillips Studio and the early clothing of some of the great performers, or the Buddy Holly stuff and everything else. I mean, I love all the other stuff, but the roots of rock and roll, that's what I was always drawn to. And every time there was something that had to deal with that, or the great when they had the exhibit with Dick Clark and everything else with the podium and all that, and the great videos of rock and roll TV and everything else.
Yeah, rock on television.
Yeah.
For me, there's three. One is the Beach Boys, because it was early in my life. And then as the director, I got to present them one of the actual plaques that the Rock Hall has given the Beach Boys, short of their induction. The second one, and I grew up with that music. I play that music now, but a lot of them are gone. The second exhibit for me would be the Beatles, because my whole life has been around one of their songs. They always ask me, well, what's your favorite group? I say the Beach Boys. What's your favorite song? The Beatles, because A Little Help from My Friends. That's how we do things in Cleveland. That's how we did the Rock Hall. And that's God's truth. And the third one is Elvis Presley, because I remember in fourth grade, we had show and tell, and I took a green Gene Autry guitar to school in 4th grade and played to a record, lip sync, Hound Dog and Don't Be Cruel. So that's mine.
I got to share. You brought up something about the Beatles. I got to share this with you, all of you. That in the back of the book, there's a picture of myself with John Lennon. There, we put a half dozen pictures in. I didn't want to put 100 or so pictures in there, but anyway, I look at that picture of John Lennon and I think about November of 1974 at the Beacon Theater in New York City. I was hosting a show they called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And all the celebrities in New York, I was the guy out front with the microphone, and Peter Boyle would come up, Mary Travers would come up, all the Marvin Hamlish and everything else, and John Lennon. And then afterwards, we went to a club called the Hippopotamus in New York City. And I was sitting there with John, and I had my book with me. That's when he wrote down the first person to autograph my book. I said, John, would you sign it? And he wrote, Rock On, John Lennon, drew a caricature with the nose and everything else like that. And since that time, because he signed it, George Martin signed it, Ringo Starr signed it, Keith Richards signed it, goes on and on. But the point of it is, when he looked at this book, he said, there's something fascinating about these early performers of rock and roll. He says, I've always loved this era. He says, do me a favor. I said, what? What would you? He says, could I get a copy of this book? I said, of course. So he wrote down on a piece of paper the Dakota, his address and everything else like that. He says, I got to have a copy of this book because these are the performers that I listened to as a youngster growing up in Liverpool. These are the people I love. And I'll never forget that evening sitting with him for about a half hour. And all he wanted to do was talk about my book and rock and roll and the early years of rock and roll and who was living in New York from that rock and roll era. It was amazing.
Yeah, that book, Rock On, of yours, Norm, of course, was a big, important book early on for many years about the history of rock and roll.
Yeah. And I would say, Norman, at some point, you better be donating that book with all those caricatures to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
I would like to have the book on display, if nothing else. I'll tell you why. That book, first of all the people that purchased my Rock On books early, every time I go someplace, they'll show me all tattered and torn and said, hey, look at I got this book. I'll tell you why that book is so rare. First of all, if you take a book and you take off the dust cover, on the spine of every book is stamped the title of the book. There's no title on the books on this book because it was hand bound at the bindery. But in this, like I said, the people I mentioned, John Lennon and George Martin and Keith Richards and Les Paul and Carl Perkins and Roy Orbison and the Beach Boys, and it goes on and on and on. Lieber and Stoller, just B.B. King, Benny King, dozens and dozens and dozens. And some of them wrote funny things, everything else like that. And I showed this to, and one guy said to me, he said, you know what this is? This is the holy grail of rock and roll books. He said, people should see this. And maybe we could have that book on display where they could take a picture of the pages of the Everly Brothers. I mean, so many of the people, Little Richard, Fats Domino, Chuck Berry, they all signed this book and have it on display in a nice case where someone could look at it and say, because I was very proud. They said this was the very first book ever to deal with American rock and roll when it came out in November of 1974, 46 years ago. And I would love people to see firsthand and look at the various pages of all the different people that have signed this book. And it could be Tony Bennett signed it, Johnny Mathis signed it. I mean, it's the who's who, Frankie Valli. I mean, they're all in there. Yeah. So I think this is something that maybe the Hall of Fame would like to be able to put on display.
Well, speaking of displays, Jason, let me hit you. Since Mike Benz did 3 exhibits that are his favorite, I'll give them to you quickly because there's an exhibit when you go past the blues and gospel and country, which is amazing, and Elvis, which is great. There's a whole case that's really the golden age of rock and roll, and I'm going to grab that one because in that case is Dion. There's Wanda Jackson. There's Little Richard, that jumpsuit. There's Chuck Berry's guitar. There's Doc Pomus. There's Bo Diddley. It's all, and Buddy Holly, all in that one case. So that's one. And then if you keep going through, I'm going to pick the one that's up right now. It's called Play It Loud, and it's an exhibit we co-curated with the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And this is the best of the best. It's got Springsteen's #1 guitar, Stevie Ray Vaughan's main guitar, Eric Clapton's Tears from Heaven. It's got a Joe Strummer guitar that is just, it echoes through the years. It's just incredible stuff. And then for the third exhibit, it's one we opened last year. We talked about the garage. It's a place where visitors actually play instruments. You're in it, but you can jam, you can play. Mike, you can hop behind the drums. Norm will give you a bass. Tom, you play keyboards. We can crank in there. And any visitor can do that at any time when this garage is open. And we've had the members of Metallica in there jamming with people. We've had other bands in there from Deep Purple members and Alice Cooper's band. All of them come in and play, and every visitor has a chance to play it. So that garage has really been wonderful. And I would put that right up there with anything we've done.
You know, it's very important, I think, Greg, you point out the garage where you are, Jason, that I have not heard as much reaction to anything in the 25 years in one exhibit, as if you could call it an exhibit, as that. And it also really, I think, exemplifies the fact that it's not a static museum. It's not a mausoleum of music or of rock and roll. It's really a living and breathing entity that creates its own excitement.
Well,
there's a side story to that, Tom, that Greg, I don't even know if you've heard this. Norman certainly knows it. Back in the day, without mentioning names, I remember early discussions about, well, we want this to be a legitimate museum. This has got to be like the New York Met, it's got to be, legitimate. And we said, it's got to be exciting and electric, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, it's got to be. And I'm not sure who came up with the term, but around that era, they came up with the term edutainment. Education, entertainment, alive, and you guys have brought it. I mean, when you go there, you don't have to just look. You participate. You are part of it. And so it is exciting. It is definitely not a static museum.
Yeah.
Play it loud, man.
That's really interesting, right? You think about that, what you bring up there, Mike and Greg, what you touched on, this idea that from the early days of trying to make the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and have this location to tell the history, but still be vibrant today. And, the stories we've been hearing tonight, that so many of the folks who were involved, even from the earliest days of thinking about the museum, are still part of it now. And that's how important this art form is for so many of us. It's part of our lives and just continues to evolve. The garage, again, for me, is one of my favorite too. Greg and I, who both play, have been up here in this room with some of the folks he's named, and just even, be in this space and hear the music happening. It's so incredible. Greg, one of the questions that came in on Facebook that maybe you could even answer here, we're celebrating 25 years of the history, this incredible book that Tom and Norm have put together, telling the foundation and the forming of it. But the first 25 years, Greg, what do we see for the next 25 years? They're asking, where does this museum go? How do we keep this vibrancy moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? We all have to think about where we're going. And I'll say the last few years have informed that in a big way. We've built some amazing, important things at the museum. We've kept the great exhibits. We've kept the artifacts that mean so much, but we're creating a little more of an immersive experience. We have the Power of Rock Theater, where you feel the emotions of rock and roll, and the great Jonathan Demme put this show together for us. And we have the garage where you play music. We're always going to honor the inductees every year. They now have their own gallery. We only opened it 2 years ago. They have a gallery that every year becomes the new inductee gallery. And we're going to focus more on artist engagement, keeping them involved with the museum. We have a robust schedule of live music on our front plaza in the summer months. And the museum itself is going to continue to be a great experiential place, and we'll continue to evolve that. Meanwhile, we have a traveling exhibits program. Right now, we have 3 exhibits that are on the road. We're going to keep doing that to bring the Rock Hall to people that can't come to Cleveland, and it will whet their appetite, and they're going to want to come here. We have an exhibit at College Station at the Bush Presidential Library that's pretty massive, about rock and politics. We have an exhibit about broadcasting that's at the Museum of Broadcasting in Chicago. We have an exhibit that some of you saw called Rock and Roll and Pinball that's up in Saratoga, New York, at a museum there. We're going to do more of that. And what we learned in the last few months is that we have digital content that is really meaningful. and people around the world. We talk about being in all 50 states. Well, everywhere where people speak English, they're accessing our Rock Hall content online. They're using Jason's educational content. They're learning about not just the history of music, but they're learning about the history of people and eras in times through the prism of rock and roll. We're going to keep doing that. We're going to start doing that in some other languages as well. Rock and roll is a global thing. Again, it's the most powerful art form ever created. Around the world, it's the sound of freedom. You know, rock and roll for all of us was the sound of freedom, but it's the sound of freedom right now for somebody that's sitting in some far off corner of the world. When they hear that, they know that there's kids out there that think the same thing they do and that things can be different. We have an obligation to share that, and we'll just keep growing and reaching out. And our goal isn't just to maintain this and polish it. Our goal is to keep extending it and keep impacting more and more people.
Thank you, Greg. Well said, right? That message and that music keeps going out all the time and giving us new opportunities to connect. I think as we wrap up tonight, we had one more question from the audience here that I'll pose to Norm and Tom, which is that there's so much in the book they want to know, is there any good story that you could tell the audience tonight that didn't make it into the book? Anything that ended up on the cutting room floor that you want to share with us tonight?
Careful, boys.
Yeah.
Yes, let's keep it appropriate. Thank you, Mike. That's important to point out. But anything in there that you want to share that maybe didn't make it in about the story?
Well, the only thing I could think of personally, and the fact that there are a couple of things that were left out of the book. Why? Because it would point a bad finger at certain people that I knew about. It would be very, very exciting and make a lot of headlines, but I chose out of courtesy to disregard it. I think the complete package has been there. The other things, the trimmings that were cut, and as you said, left on the cutting room floor, Jason, is the fact that these things probably weren't in good taste to put in the book. And I'm very proud of the way the book is. And that's why in my opinion, I left them out.
You're a gentleman.
But I think, really, it's not a salacious book at all, right? It is a really great balanced story about the history of the museum.
Everyone should be proud of the book, and that's the whole thing.
Yeah, it's safe for work no matter where you work. And I will say there really aren't any good stories that were left out, because if it was a good story, I figured out a way to get it in, to clean it up or fudge it enough, the names, the identities enough that we could get it in. When you're doing something like that, it's as important to know what you leave out as to know what you put in. And we didn't leave out, I didn't want to leave out anything good. And
well, in doing that, I will say that the narrative didn't suffer, because it's really exciting. It's an exciting read, and you wove it well.
Also,
I agree. Quite literally a page turner. It keeps you.
I want to thank the people at Kent State University, Christine Brooks, who designed the book. She did. I was a little apprehensive, because I met with Christine. And I told her about the cover and everything else. And I coming from the rock and roll world and looking at rock and roll album covers and everything else like that. And I met with her and I said, geez, I just don't want something plain and simple. And I was very, very proud of the way she designed the cover and the whole book with the sidebars and everything else. And all the people at Kent State University Press that worked so good with us to making this book a reality. And I want to thank them all.
Yeah, it really does look beautiful. All the photos in here, all of the research and the work. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for doing such a great book. And thank you for joining us tonight to talk about it. Mike, thank you for joining us, too, to hear that story. And Director -1 and 2, so you had 2 posts you filled. And Greg, as always, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Greg, anything you want to say as we wrap up the evening here?
I'll echo what you just said, Jason. On behalf of everybody at the museum, Norm, Mike, Tom, we're very grateful for you participating in this, but we're grateful that you've told this story and done it so well. These things get lost to the fog of history over time, and this story is documented. It's something that we'll celebrate for years to come, and it gives us great commitment to uphold all the hard work you guys did to get this built, to uphold all of the people that called into the USA Today polls and had the parades and had the events and had all of that sort of stuff. Everybody that contributed to make it happen. We have an immense responsibility to the history of rock and roll, but also to the people of Northeast Ohio that built this, and we're forever grateful. So
thank you, Greg, and thank you, Jason, and Mike and Tom. What a pleasure being with all of you tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Greg, and thanks for always making us that we're involved early and throughout feel welcome. You know, my family thanks you. It is a part of my legacy. Spent a lot of time with this thing, and Tom and Norm, you did a fabulous job. Jason, thanks for the opportunity, and Greg, my brother, I'll see you soon.
Well, the museum's open. Come on down.
And I'll say that too, Greg. That's a great point. Everyone out there, come on down and see us here at the Rock Hall. Don't forget, you can still get the book. Check that link that we were sharing at the bottom of your screen to order the book if you haven't already. And for those of you who did, be patient, because Norm is going to be in here at the Rock Hall next week signing your book, and we'll get it shipped out to you then. Gentlemen, thank you so much for a great evening of stories, and thank you to everyone for joining us. So rock on, everybody, and have a great evening. Good night.